Okay, well, why don't we get started? Everyone, it's such a pleasure to welcome you here to our Global Community Bio Summit Town Hall, which is a very, very special session that we're having on opening up community labs, and it's going to be led by Yong-Bee, who I'll turn it over to in just a moment. But I wanted to welcome everybody and thank you all for joining. We've been having these regular town hall meetings since the COVID-19 pandemic hit. And recently we decided that we would love to change the focus of our town halls and really start communicating great content to our community and the larger public about this movement around community bio labs, and all of the issues that are connected to how we can really do science in a democratized and open way. And so this special session today, again, is the first one that we're launching. We're going to be introducing regular town halls like this, where we'll have topics of interest to the community, and we'll again pull together a great set of panelists and speakers to communicate as much as we can to our community and to the world. And so if you have ideas or thoughts on other types of topics that you'd like us to cover, feel free to put those into the chat. You can also send us an email at info@biosummit.org. And I will say too, again, very much in the spirit of BioSummit, this experience that we're about to embark on together today is very much a prototype. This year, we will be having BioSummit. For those of you that were unsure or didn't know, it's going to be in October. And we're going to be experimenting with a lot of different types of video platforms and ways to engage virtually. Again, I think hopefully a number of you now have experienced different types of virtual conferences. And of course, so much of the magic of the BioSummit is about the experience and the participation and the engagement with the community. So we really want to experiment with different ways to engage with our community virtually. And so you are going to be our guinea pigs as we experiment and work together to try to figure out some of the most creative ways that we can engage with each other. So as we unfold these town halls, please be mindful that we are very much trying and experimenting ourselves. So with that, I just want to welcome you all again. And I really want to shout out Yong-Bee for all of his amazing hard work in pulling this together. So we can do a little virtual clap for Yong-Bee for making this all happen. And again, to all of the amazing panelists for your contributions too. So Yong-Bee, go for it, man.
Well, David, thank you so much for that fantastic introduction. And yeah, we're embarking on something new. And I think that's really what the spirit of the Global Bio Summit is about, is embarking on new things and building bridges. So I was really happy to be able to take on this task of bringing together this amazing group of people to talk about a very salient topic, I feel, during COVID, which is trying to figure out how to reopen or reboot your community biolab in the time of COVID. And I'm just going to start with a few general remarks. I really want to make sure that there is an interactive component with this discussion. So during the last 10 to 15 minutes, I wanted to let people know that there's a Q&A. So input for this is important. Throughout the discussion, feel free to ask any questions in the chat, or actually you could also directly message Carolyn Angleton, and she would be able to take some of those questions down, and hopefully we'll be able to use them during the Q&A, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible in the time allotted. So with that in mind, I would like to introduce my esteemed panelists, and also I like to think of them as my friends. The first individual is Maria Chavez. As many of you know, she wears many hats in the community bio environment, but she's currently the president and she's a board member at BioCurious, which is a community lab based in Santa Clara, California. And Maria, I just wanted to ask you, why do you think participating in this panel is important, and what is something you hope to get out of it?
Well, for me, I think it's important to participate because we're all going to struggle with this. This is something that's, you hate using the word unprecedented, but we've never seen labs have to shut down like this, where small spaces, we're unprecedented as it is to have community labs, and we've always shared with each other, and understanding the risks, in this case, biological risks to a biological lab, there's no way to do it on your own. The only way to have a culture of safety is by sharing and talking. What I hope to do is learn some things and best practices we're not doing yet that we should be. Because we don't think we have all the answers. We're struggling just as much as everybody else.
Absolutely. No, thank you very much for sharing that, Maria. And the next panelist I would like to introduce is Angela Armendariz. She's the Director of Operations and Co-Director of GenSpace, which is a community lab based in Brooklyn, New York. And I'd like to ask you the same question as well, Angela. Why do you think participating in this panel is important, and what do you hope to get out of it?
Hi, Yong-Bee, and hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. And hello to GenSpace members that I see in the crowd. I'm really excited to be a part of this because you guys are my peers. Like, there's no one else doing what we're doing. And I've been listening into a lot of different webinars and panels and just like reopening, but they're specific to incubator spaces or specific to biotech, but there's not been any like community bio. Like I do want to hear from everyone what everyone else is thinking, and happy to share what we're thinking and how we're trying to move forward through this. Yeah, just very grateful to be a part of it. So thank you.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for being here. And also a panelist that I happen to know quite well because I've been going to Bugs fairly often since it's the closest community lab to me. Tom Burkett is the founder, the former executive director, and current board member of the Baltimore Underground Science Space, which is a community lab based in Baltimore, Maryland. Tom, what do you hope to get out of this, and why do you think participating in this panel is important?
Well, to echo what Maria said, I don't think we can really solve these on our own. And I think that, part of being involved with a community biolab is that community spirit. So not just within the lab, but among all the different labs. So I think it's important for that reason. And also just to share what different people are doing. I don't think that one person or one lab is going to look at it from all the different angles that need to be looked at. So I hope to learn, probably learn more than I can contribute, but that's, learn from my peers.
No, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Tom. And I think one of the things about Global Community BioSummit is about building off of people's connections and building those ties. And so I am really happy to be able to introduce one of my ties to the Global BioSummit community. Saskia Popescu is a public health and biodefense expert from George Mason University, which is where I'm also based. And she works as an infectious disease epidemiologist and infection preventionist based in Arizona. So Saskia, I would also like to pose the same question, which is, why do you think participating in this panel is important? And what is something you hope to get out of it?
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. First of all, infection preventionists and epidemiologists don't normally get to chat with community bio members, so I'm really excited to actually get to engage with you and learn from you. But I think have these conversations that are so important and we've been missing out on. So hopefully solve problems together and know that we are a resource, and hopefully we can kind of create a stronger relationship moving forward so that you have that resource in the community.
No, absolutely. Thank you. And I think Saskia is a fantastic representation for the public health community for this type of conversation. So I'd like to focus maybe for the next 10 to 15 minutes on the community labs at this point. I know one of the significant decisions that community labs had to face in the face of COVID-19 was the prospect of closing the labs, which I believe all of the panelists' community labs did. So I'd like to start with Angela. Were there concerns about closing down GenSpace and what kind of the implications were of that?
Were there concerns about closing GenSpace? Yeah, definitely. We have a lot of different types of programming, and we're really concerned about losing so much of what we do and so much of the community aspect of what we do. But I felt like, we have been able to pivot to do a lot of things online. And I'm sure you'll hear this from the other panelists as well. It's like we've moved a lot of our classes and workshops and discussion groups and even some of our community projects to online. But yeah, I mean, there are, individual projects who are not being able to move forward. There is, again, that community building that we're not really able to do in the way that we normally do. So yeah, a lot of concerns about having to close this space.
Right, absolutely. And Tom, one of the things that Bugs has done in the midst of all of this COVID-19 lab shutdown experience was a lot of what Angela just discussed, which was moving to an online format. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how Bugs has been able to adapt to a specific project that you've been involved in, which is the Inner Harbor Project.
Well, so we were luckily at a place in that project where most of the lab work was completed. I think I actually went in and did the very last step, which took me a half hour or something like that. And then we were able to send off all these samples we'd collected, get the sequence information. So it had moved into a phase that was pretty amenable to doing online the data analysis and figuring out we're writing a paper together on it. So that sort of collaboration. So it was luck, blind luck, that we were at the place where we were with that project. Because if it had happened a month earlier or 2 months earlier, it would have been the whole project probably would have come to a halt for a while. So.
Right, absolutely. And, there are like these weekly meetings that are happening only through, only being able to do them through Zoom. No, absolutely. And, Maria, so one of the things that I often think about when it comes to community labs is community labs serve a lot of different purposes in their communities. So there's space for people to engage in science education. There's space for people to explore the life sciences, whether it's within themselves or their environment. It's also a place where people can engage in entrepreneurship and also empower themselves to be able to maybe do things that they might not have been able to do without some, basic biological background training. One of the big things with BioCurious is there's a very strong entrepreneurship element that I felt while I was out at BioCurious, but also, all of the kind of community building and education elements as well. How has, what were your concerns as BioCurious needed to shut down, especially when it came to things like these startup companies that were essentially housed within BioCurious?
Yeah, about a third of our members are startups, and that's over 50% of our revenue. And that's not just a responsibility that we keep going because of the startups. The startups exist because they have an affordable space to work out of. So it's a bit of a responsibility to be able to be open, to allow them to do their business. The startup world is very aggressive. We know in biotech, it's really hard to be a startup because of the startup capital and the difficulty in doing a small biotech startup. So it was difficult, but we had a series of town halls on Zoom like everybody else did and said, you guys, there's really no choice. The county's making us shut down. We had 1 or 2 people who pushed back on us about that. And it was one of those, we're not prepared to make exceptions for anybody right now because we're still grappling with this ourselves. So we did a full shutdown. We offered members the option to pause their membership. So it's like, you guys, aren't getting used to the lab. We didn't announce it. We did it as people requested, and we announced it softly at the town halls. And some people said, yeah, this is when I'm not using the lab, it's a strain. So we took a hit for a couple of months, and then we've been working on our reopening protocols in the meantime, but that's been our priority. And as part of that priority has been a phased reopening. So I think, we're one of the first to come open. Santa Clara County let people who are doing biotechnology and medical research open a couple of weeks ago. And so what we said is not all of our members fall under that, but the startups mostly all fall under that. And a lot of them rent offices from us. So they're socially distanced from each other. So they have individual offices to work in. They rent benches from us. So they've got their own benches. So again, they're distanced from each other already. So we did a phase 1 reopening with just those 15 members to see how it would go. And it's gone really, really well. So now we've gone to phase 2 this week, which is expanding the protocols, working on our messaging, and letting all members in, but just members, no visitors. But the startups were our priority because they're losing business. And it's not just the business, but a lot of them are doing projects that are good for the world, some of them COVID adjacent sort of diagnostics type projects too.
No, that absolutely makes sense. And, this is the first time I've actually heard that, a lab has actually started the reopening process. I know that Tom, for example, you and I've had conversations about how the Bugs Board has been looking to establish some protocols and some practices to begin the reopening process. Are there any kind of concerns as the board moves forward with reopening, and what do some of these preliminary practices look like?
Well, so what we did was kind of like what Maria did, was we looked at our members and who was using the lab, and so we kind of grouped those into 4 categories. We've got people who use the lab who are very experienced, don't really need much. They've worked in the lab for a while, so they know where things are and how to operate equipment, and don't really need much in the way of hand-holding. And so this week, we're actually allowing them into the lab. So starting tomorrow, I think. So we've got scheduled times. We're actually, for this first phase, we're only allowing 1 person into the lab at a time. And they have to schedule and sign up in advance for that. The next group are those members who don't have as much experience or are working in small groups, like our community lab projects. And we won't be letting those into the lab until at least after the 4th of July. Kind of see how the first part goes. And then the next two groups are our more inexperienced or larger classes. So adults and minor classes. So we have an iGEM team that has been primarily operating online, designing their project. And iGEM as a competition this year is going to a completely all online format. But the students from our iGEM team want to get in the lab, so we're trying to figure out how to bring them back into the lab to do some work beginning sometime in July. Haven't quite worked out those protocols yet, but so right now we're just starting with those people who can be in there, and individuals or small groups on a scheduled time.
No, that makes sense. And Angela, you've kind of heard 2 different examples of, people finding ways to develop protocols and the considerations that they've had. How kind of compatible or reflective is that of the GenSpace process as well? And maybe, potentially some different considerations as well, given I feel like each community lab in its each individual geography and kind of sociocultural context all feel and operate and do different things.
Yeah, I would say we're definitely kind of a different level right now, and compared to the other 2 labs. Our board and us are still determining if we're even going to be opening at all this summer, because we have a lot of concerns, a lot of safety concerns about the reopening of the lab. So New York State has some requirements for businesses to reopen that include everything from screening and tracing and cleaning processes and PPE requirements and just the social distancing that needs to be reinforced. And in our building, we don't actually own the building. We rent a space in a building, so we don't control things like the bathrooms, for example. So we have a lot of concerns of just the safety of having our space reopened, and also there's just financial concern, because in order to do all of those things, it requires the staffing and the manpower, and financially, we do rely on classes and workshops and public programs pretty heavily for just paying our rent and keeping us going. And so being unable to do that, and we don't foresee being able to bring small groups together like that. I mean, our classes are hands-on. We're next to each other. So we don't really see us being able to do that. And so with that, then how can we even if we were able to manage the incremental and small use of the space by our members, then is that going to be financially feasible for us is a question. So we're still doing a lot of thinking and deciding with our board around that. And, you know, I mean, just being in New York City, I think maybe there's just like this sort of heightened concern too, just, you know, people rely on public transportation and we don't know yet how, you know, New York City has just moved into phase 1 of reopening. And so it's pretty low use of transportation right now, but that will increase. And so yeah, a lot of concerns, and we're really not there yet. Although we have been thinking, of course, about what that would look like if we did reopen. And like I said, the New York guidelines have a plan that you've got to like fill out all of the ways that you will, you know, adhere to social distancing, et cetera. So we are thinking about that, but we're not quite there yet.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. And, you know, I think that this really paints, you know, a very good detailed overview of, you know, the challenges that community labs face when it comes to operating in these times. So, you know, there was adaptability in the sense that community labs could move to a virtual format, could teach in those spaces, but, you know, several kind of elements that kept coming up were the financial elements, you know, the membership fees and, you know, the kind of money that goes towards actually keeping these spaces operating, you know, paying the rent, the electricity, the reagents, you know, all of these kinds of things. So with that kind of as a backdrop, I'd like to pivot at this point to bringing in our public health expert, Saskia. And so, I kind of wanted to start with a general overview because I feel like in the discourse about COVID-19 in the United States, it feels like there are two Americas. So there's the America that wants to return to a sense of normalcy, restarting large campaign rallies, reopening states quickly from phase 1 to completely reopening. And then there's the America where there are more than 20 states right now that saw increases in their 7-day average of new COVID-19 cases, with rapid increases in geographically distant states like Florida, Oregon, Texas, and the state that you reside in, Arizona. So could you kind of provide me from your experiences what your thoughts are on how well reopening efforts are going in the United States?
I think it's really challenging. The first piece is so many people tend to look at our status, our COVID response on a national level, and that's really not the case anymore. You have to look at it more at a local level because everybody's in a different situation. We're having varying levels of community transmission. And as you mentioned, there are so many states that are currently in a position where they're seeing rapid increases in cases. So the first piece is when we start to look at where are we with COVID? You know, there's some people that are saying, oh, we're in our second wave. Many states, including the one I'm in, never really saw a first wave.
I think this is a good lesson in dealing with the public and how do you deal with things that unexpectedly come up in your lab. This is
Indeed
a moment for all of us when the unexpected comes up.
What a segue, Maria.
Always, always.
No, that was an excellent segue, Maria. And I'm so sorry, Saskia, that you were interrupted while so rudely while discussing your thoughts on COVID, kind of like the reopening of America during COVID. So if you'd like to continue.
Sure. So I was taking some notes while everyone was speaking, which was really helpful. So thank you. I kind of wanted to go back to the notion that everybody is in a very different state. Reopening, just like response, has been rather disjointed. So I do think that's an important thing to remember as you're considering that. When you are looking at potentially reopening a lab, I encourage you to think two things. What's going on locally, and what are my descaling efforts if this happens again? So a big piece to this is sustainability, because one thing we've noticed in healthcare is that you are going to spend a ton of money getting ready for something and trying to potentially reopen. But what happens if you have to scale back down and then scale back up? So having a sustainable plan is not only going to make your life easier, but it's also going to save you money, which is really important right now, because I think, you know, we all need to maintain a continuity. So many states didn't really meet criteria for reopening. I live in one that definitely didn't. And as we're seeing a lot of states kind of opted to either reopen way too early or way too fast. And what that really means is, you know, when you're looking at reopening something, you have to start with, okay, this is the criteria and I'm meeting it, awesome. So I'm going to start to do this incrementally and slowly. So the first phase is normally elective surgeries, give it a couple weeks to make sure everybody is functioning okay, and then kind of the next phase. And Arizona, we just kind of opened the floodgates and now we're paying for that. So I'm going to use that as a case example simply because I'm living in it. And I think it's a really telling indicator that any reopening process has to be slow. It has to be incremental because you have to be able to see if what you're doing is impacting case counts, but also your capabilities. You know, you don't want to overwhelm or stress your resources, and that could impact safety. So reopening too early, too fast, hospital capability, but that also has implications for PPE, which is really relevant. You know, do you have access to masks, to gowns, gloves, all of those critical things? Because right now they all feel in short supply, but this also extends beyond PPE. I think we've been really focused on that. What about disinfectants? This is a huge thing that hospitals are struggling with right now too. You know, we can make bleach supply all we want, but if you have medical equipment or lab equipment that is going to be degraded and broken down by bleach, how do you find something that's still effective but not impacting your medical supplies or your lab supplies? So the first piece to this, I encourage everybody, look at your local public health data. Check out the county and the state health department websites. If you're seeing a consistent downwards trend in cases, that's a good sign. But one piece is that also you have to communicate to people that just because we're reopening doesn't mean there's no cases in the community. That false sense of security can be really dangerous. And I think we've all seen that with people rushing out to bars and, you know, clubs and restaurants. Everybody is so ready to get back to their normal life, but this is going to be the new normal. So that communication strategy is a huge piece to this. So look at your local public health data to see what's really going on in your state, because a lot of times that doesn't match the reopening that's been done at larger levels. So that should help kind of gauge what's going on and how safely you can go about this. Labs in general can be challenging to open. You have close quarters in many cases. You have a lot of people working in tight confinements for a prolonged period of time. So intervention efforts are really important. The first piece to this, I always say, is what's your plan if you have an employee that ends up being positive? Do you have a protocol to look at who was exposed? Do you know what an exposure means? So CDC guidance actually says, were you face-to-face with this person, meaning less than 6 feet, for more than 15 minutes without wearing a mask? That's what an exposure actually is defined as. So I encourage people as they reopen, you know, you want to make sure you have the necessary safety protocols in place, but also the response measures. So if you do have an exposure and you have somebody who's been working, how do you respond to that? Aside from identifying who was exposed, you also have to look at 48 hours before that person had symptoms. That's really when we're considering them infectious. So if you have somebody that calls in and says, you know, I don't feel good today, I'm going to stay home, and they end up testing positive, you have to look 48 hours back from when their symptoms start and really consider who was exposed during that time. And then decide, are we going to send people home and quarantine them for 14 days? Are we going to let them work as long as they wear a mask? All of these pieces are really important. So another piece to this is also having a culture, an environment that encourages people to be transparent about this. I've seen too often where people are scared to say, I don't feel well, or I tested positive for COVID-19 because they think they're going to get reprimanded. And we don't want that. We want a just culture where people feel comfortable reporting. And even if that's an anonymous reporting system, that's fine. But just a way that they can share and say, hey, I actually tested positive, or my partner at home is positive for COVID-19. How can I safely be at work? All of these things. So another piece is disinfectants. I'm sure I don't need to tout too much about this, but just make sure whatever you're using is on the list N from the EPA for viral pathogens claim. That's a really important piece because right now I am seeing so many companies with claims saying they can, kill COVID-19. I'm like, well, you're not actually killing COVID-19. You're killing SARS-CoV-2, but that's a red flag right there. So there's a lot of companies that are making these very wild claims about all of the things they can do, whether it's suddenly a plethora of UV disinfection protocols or, a disinfecting mist. All of these things there are companies out there that do them well and meet the criteria for that. But that being said, there's a lot of grifters going on right now. So being mindful, because there's so much money being invested in this stuff. And the last thing I want anybody to do is say, I should get UV disinfection in my air system for $10,000, when that's really not necessary. And there's a lot of other things you can be doing that are much more cost effective. So that's a big piece. Workflow. This is a tight space. So 4 factors we look at when it comes to high risk for transmission. That's how many people are in this space? What kind of activity are they doing? You know, I'm hoping in labs you guys aren't like dancing and yelling and screaming at each other, because that obviously increases risk for transmission, but who knows, people get wild and have fun. So that being said, those are things that can increase the transmission. So you're looking at the activity, the prolonged period of time. You know, are you together for a few minutes or 2 hours, 8 hours? How many people are in that environment? And what kind of environment is this? Is this an enclosed, tight space with limited air ventilation? All of those things can increase the risk. So I encourage you to kind of look at your workflow and to see how you can maybe avoid clustering of people or reduce some of those higher risk components. So another piece to this is areas we tend to forget about. Break rooms, common areas, coffee machines. People cluster in these areas, and because they're not in their lab or in their patient care area or wherever they consider the risk, that's when they become lackadaisical. And that's when we take off our masks, because we're drinking coffee or we're eating or we're conversing, and sometimes wearing a mask is really frustrating and we're all burnt out from it. So that's actually where we've seen so many exposures with healthcare workers. It's break rooms, it's birthday parties, it's all those things where we become a little bit more lax because we're so focused on the high risk aspect of our jobs and we forget about the break moments. So be mindful of that. It's not that people can't use break rooms or coffee machines, but stagger them. Make sure that they're socially distanced, and that, you know, if you are going to, you know, have multiple people in those rooms, make sure they have the space and they're aware that they do need to put their masks back on after they're done eating. So that's a really big issue I've seen. And then the last piece I want to note is PPE. I think we all feel comfortable putting on gloves and masks and, you know, protective equipment, but how comfortable are you that people are doing best practice? So one piece to this is we all become really accustomed to our habits, and sometimes those habits aren't very good. So a reminder, a re-education is really, really helpful, because I know when I'm taking off my gloves, you know, you're so used to just like flinging them off. That's a really easy way to cross-contaminate. Or when you're removing your mask, all of these things seem very second nature if you do them all the time, but that doesn't mean you're actually doing them right. So I encourage you to kind of consider a re-education, a retraining. It doesn't have to take long. Oh, and I wanted to also add, Angela brought up a really great point that sometimes these are rented spaces. So consider that rented space and who is responsible for cleaning it, for disinfecting it, making sure that that's actually safe. Because, you know, I've seen this in healthcare a lot where we rent spaces and somebody else is responsible for cleaning it, but I don't know the quality of their work. So I have to make sure, what products are you using? How often are you cleaning it? That's a really important piece to remember, because we don't want to assume that a third party is actually doing something that could impact our safety. So those are all some critical points when it comes to reopening safely, lab processes, and just things that you were all sharing. So I really appreciate it.
No, absolutely. And I just really briefly wanted to go over this idea too. You know, you could get all of the the best advice that you can. And I think that what's really important here is the emphasis that you put on for the situation that you're in, for the geographic context that you're in, because not everybody's going to have unlimited resources to be able to get everything, possibly. It's going to be kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. We're going to try to figure it out as we go along. And that's something that you and I often operate in, which is from the defense sector, the public health sector, this idea of uncertainty. So we're always going to be operating in an area, in a field of uncertainty. So do you have any kind of words of wisdom or advice to make sure that community labs maybe don't overthink it and kind of go, hey, it's okay that we're operating in a field of uncertainty at this point, and we're just, trying to make the best of it and do the best that we can?
I think, I always tell people this is an evolving situation. No one is doing it perfectly. And we are literally building the bridge as we walk across it. So do the best you can, use the literature that's out there, the resources, the people out there, but know that you're constantly going to be evolving and learning. So what might work this week might not work next week. And so much of this is really, it feels very stressful and very second guessing. I constantly am second guessing myself when I'm telling people how to do something, but then there's a process of implementing a plan and then watching it and making sure it works. So I would be always really concerned if you just rolled out a protocol for something, you know, in a safety measure, and then just kind of sat back and let it happen. Mm-hmm. Keep an eye on things, because we need to constantly be doing better, especially as cases, you know, wane or we have new waves. So just know that we're kind of all in the same boat. Nobody's doing it perfectly, but you know, you have a lot of support and a lot of resources. And I encourage you, you know, as an infection preventionist, we spend time in labs, in our hospital labs. Reach out to the IP at local hospitals. You'd be surprised. We love getting out and offering support and looking at workflows, because that's part of the thing that we do, is actually looking at you doing work to make sure it's actually being done safety. So just know that this is an evolving process. This is something we're all learning in, and everybody's just doing the best they can.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And so I kind of wanted to maybe devote, you know, unfortunately we were bummed, and so we kind of lost a little bit of time, maybe 5 minutes for discussion between the panelists in terms of, you know, one of the questions that kind of seems to be coming up is there is this kind of financial struggle issue of making sure that, you know, and hands-on experience for, you know, bringing people in, which is kind of anathema to addressing COVID concerns in a community space. Are there particular practices that you might recommend? I know you listed a few involving PPE and, you know, disinfectant, but are there like specific things that you might recommend in situations where community labs might be trying to hold a class, a hands-on class, to try to mitigate, you know, issues related to COVID-19?
I think a big piece is obviously making sure people are wearing masks. All these little pieces we focus on individually sometimes, but it's the collective effort that really is what's making it. So if you wear a mask but you don't socially distance, so I think teaching all of those pieces, hand hygiene, not touching your face, which I know I'm definitely guilty of, and kind of looking at how your day-to-day activities are and seeing how you can maybe make them a little bit safer by, you know, distancing yourself, or maybe looking at timeframes for different people coming in. So, you know, I think when you're holding classes, talk to them about pragmatic, realistic ways to be safer and what that means, because it's really easy for me to sit here and say, you need to be wearing your PPE, you need to be able to clean everything. But what does that actually mean? How often do they need to do that? You know, break down a step, actually go through a process that you do daily and talk about the risks and the areas for intervention. I think that's really helpful. People learn best from examples, especially hands-on examples. So I always like having a healthcare worker show me a task, and then we can talk about ways that it can be done safer or adjust things to make them easier for them to be done safely. So part of this is either individuals sometimes failing at this, or the process itself isn't working. So I think if you focus on a task, that can be really helpful for an entire group of people. And if you're holding those classes, obviously you want to maintain social distancing, you know, having people really be honest and transparent about not coming in if they're sick is really helpful. Maybe hosting some of it online, all of those things.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. Absolutely. And do any of the panelists, Angela, Maria, Tom, have any questions for Saskia, or vice versa? You know, because this is really Saskia's first time interacting with the community bio community, and we're hoping that this is the first of many.
I think, you know, for our lab, the biggest question is what you just asked, Yong-Bee, is we get a fair chunk of our revenue, and one of the big things we do is have the high schoolers in, or community members doing hands-on classes, and also hands-on mentorship. We have quite a few mentors who work one-on-one with high schoolers throughout the year on their science fair projects. And those mentors are losing income, and they really want to get back in there. And they're like, well, if I'm masked and my student's masked, and it's just like, yeah, no. And I guess the two parts of that question for my fellow panelists and Saskia is, my struggle is if I want to do something like an activity like that, where I'd want the mentor and the student to sign a waiver, if I'm having them sign a waiver saying that they understand meeting together, even if we work out the logistics of that, is a risky behavior. Am I somehow condoning this risky behavior and setting a bad precedent by allowing them to do it? So that's kind of the ethical question. And other than mask wearing and good PPE, for hands-on teaching, what are the good things you can do? Because it's hard to maintain a 6 foot distance. You can probably do maybe a 4, but it's difficult.
So one piece I would add is if you can have smaller classes, that are definitely helpful. And I'm a huge fan of face shields. If you're working in close contact, that really helps increase protection for the wearer. So that might make people feel a little bit safer. And, I think definitely small groups, honestly. I mean, that's the only way to do it. I've struggled with this very issue regarding training, but the truth is if you keep the size small, and I think realistically having those conversations with people in terms of there's no such thing as zero risk. Going out in the community is risky. So here's how we're being safe. Here are these safety measures, but know that, we're not totally able to eliminate risk because we're dealing with people. That can be really helpful in terms of communicating that. So they're aware of what they're walking into. So that's one piece I would really recommend. Like I said, I'm a big fan of face shields. I think that's really helpful. And especially for students, because I've noticed, especially younger kiddos, they like touching their masks all the time, or people who just don't wear them. It's a natural habit because it's super uncomfortable and awkward. So a face shield on top of the mask prevents them from doing that, but it's also an extra layer of safety. And that really helps people feel better about the risk mitigation.
Angela,
I think for us, I just wanted to say, I think for us, I think we are feeling like it's just too big of risk to venture into right now. And, we have been trying lots of different things with our classes, and so far our online classes successfully. So I know that Beth would be, Beth Tech is here, and she'd be happy to share with you all the different things that we've been doing online. But yeah, unfortunately for us, it just feels like the risk is too high.
Tom, did you have any questions or?
So this is something that's come up in our discussions, which have been pretty vocal about bathrooms. So there are some of us who say we should just close our bathroom. We have a bathroom that people use. There are others out in the building that we're not responsible for cleaning and things like that. And so if people want to use those, they could use those. And then there are others on the board who said, no, we got to keep the bathrooms open. So what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, actually, Saskia, do you mind if I add to that too? This is sort of related. I've been really curious about like air flow and air circulation, because it seems to come up the least in all of these different requirements. So it's sort of related to the bathroom too, because I know that bathrooms can.
Yeah, so there's been so much attention to bathrooms, which I find super interesting. And I personally, I'm fine with them being kept open as long as people aren't congregating in there. So unless you have a nightclub that has a huge bathroom where people hang out in it, I think that's probably fine. I encourage people to make it quick. Go in there and definitely still wear your mask. I think that's more than appropriate. And, don't touch your face while the same rule still applies, basically what I'm saying. This isn't any different than you working at a desk in an office with multiple people. Obviously, a bathroom has a lot of high-touch surfaces, so if you can increase cleaning, that's really helpful. But the biggest piece is get in and get out. Don't hang out in there. Don't congregate in there. And wash your hands, of course. If you're concerned about lack of airflow, wearing a mask is definitely helpful. But I personally wouldn't be closing bathrooms. That's not been a risky area. I know that there's concern for the plume. That's recently been very popularized, but the truth is that there are a lot of factors that would have to go into that being a problem. So I say keep them open, increase cleaning, really push hand hygiene, and if there's any concern, just have people wear a mask. You definitely can still do that when you're going to the bathroom.
No, absolutely. And I think at this point, I know that there are many more questions. It looks like we're getting a fair number. So I have a list from the Q&A, but if there's anyone that specifically wants to raise their hand up and ask a specific question at this time to our panelists, please do so.
Oh, I think someone has a question.
Yeah, Garima?
Yes, hi. I have a question for Saskia. Can you explain a little bit more about facial? I'm not clear about it.
Yeah, so there's two different kinds of eye protection that are commonly used. Some are just like a goggle, or I say that they look like sports sunglasses, but they're just clear. And then there's another face shield that typically has an elastic band that goes around your head, and it's a full plastic clear face shield protectant, basically. So those are two different measures. I'm a fan of the shield. I find it to be a little bit comfier. It protects the entire face, so it's clear. You can just see through it and wear it. And the nice part is about those, you can reuse them. As long as you disinfect them after use, you can continuously wear them, which is nice for both longevity, but also sustainability and savings. So those are really helpful because they offer eye protection, which is really important, but they also are really nice in that they discourage people from touching their face all the time.
Great. So Angela, I see you have a question. I'm going to go to a quick question that actually was on the chat, which was before I get to you, which is, are there any resources, and this could be any of the panelists, are there any resources that you found useful for teaching good kind of like disinfecting or, safety practices? So like one of the examples I think Maria brought up in the chat was like TikTok videos seem to be quite popular to help with this. Saskia, I know you're tapped into the, the popular culture scene, especially since in the last meeting that you and I were a part of, you mentioned Miley Cyrus. So, any of the panelists, but maybe specifically Saskia, are there any kind of visual resources that you might recommend, like videos to kind of teach some of these techniques?
Specifically for lab, I really haven't seen any, which actually really points to a desperate need. So if anybody wants to do it, please do. And I'll definitely keep an eye out, because I think there's been some good social media push for like how to appropriately wear a mask or when to wear gloves and not to wear gloves. Those are helpful. But in terms of like face shields or workflow, I don't think I've seen some good videos, but I'm sure there's got to be like a TikTok video out there about working in a lab. I mean, I would be hard pressed not to see one. So, but I think that does represent a big need.
Can I jump in here? So early on, a makerspace in Seattle, I think it's Seattle Makerspace, I can't remember the exact name. They put together a YouTube video showing how they were working together in groups with face shields and masks and social pressures on touching face and disinfecting and opening doors and all that sort of thing that we found pretty useful.
No, absolutely. And I think that, I just put in the chat, but it sounds like a really interesting place where maybe community labs who are full of trained scientists could really fill a gap. So that might be an interesting initiative to see. And Angela, I would like to get back to you since I see your hand is up there. And I think this might be actually the last question that we're able to take today.
Thanks. This question is for Tom and Maria. I'm curious about, like, since you're starting to have folks come in, I'm curious about your like pre-screening process and like questionnaires for, how are you, and so pre-screening, what sort of pre-screening are you doing before people come in? And then like, what's the like sign up process that you're using? Is there any sort of software that you found that's like useful for that? Or are you just using Google Docs? How are you doing that?
I'll go real quick. We have a pretty big lab space, so we're not as limited as to who's in there, except for our tissue culture room, which does have a Google Sheets sign up that's always been in use because that room has always been in demand. We have always had a front desk iPad check-in. The change has been that when they come in the building, they need to wash their hands before they check in at the iPad. So they're disinfecting. We have disinfectant station there. So they can use hand sanitizer or go wash them, then check in on the iPad. So you can check before you come to the lab and see how many people are checked in via iPad to see how many people are at the lab. So that's something available to members. We do have an IR camera we ordered like a month and a half ago that still isn't here because they're on serious back order. So that if you don't already have one, it may be hard to get one. And we decided, since you're already at risk before you have the fever, it's not that useful. We did have the option. One of our students actually built a really nice IR camera Raspberry Pi system that takes temperatures and does all kinds of things just from a camera and does logging. And we thought about that, and then we just decided, you know what, we need to treat our members like adults because we don't have somebody here all the time. We need to, you know, expect that, as with anything with the community, we need to train them well and trust that if they're not feeling well, they're not going to come in.
Maria, that's such a great point. So we've been using IR cameras and had so many issues with them. And I do think it's important to note that only a certain percentage of actual COVID-19 cases have fevers, since body temperature is so variable with people. So another piece to this, it's also really helpful to actually post all of the symptoms so people are cognizant, because we may not realize how mild symptoms can actually, you know, present. People think you have to have like really severe pneumonia. So having that available has been really helpful for staff to kind of do that mental check. So that's a great point. Thank you.
No, absolutely. And on that note, I really want to thank everybody for attending this.
Can we get Tom's answer before we
right.
We're right on
so
time.
I'll just quickly go. So we're kind of relying on the honor system at this first phase. And we've just asked people to ask themselves, are they feeling well? So we talked to some public health people here in Baltimore that didn't recommend the use of the cameras for the different issues that have come up. And it's basically more subjective, you know, do you feel well? So we asked them to ask that. And we have a Google Docs sign-up sheet that is available to members.
No, awesome. And so on that note, I really want to thank all of my panelists for taking the time and energy. I also want to thank David for really pushing forward this new kind of format, as well as others, particularly in the comms committee for the Bio Summit, Alex Perlman, Amanda Strawhacker, Carolyn Angleton, Nell Schaefer. They have done amazing work on this, and I think we're seeing that. So we're going to continue forward. As David mentioned earlier, if you have any suggestions on new topics or things that you as a community want to discuss in this forum, send them by email to info@biosummit.org. We're also going to put in a plug for the BioSummit Fellowship Program, which is about kind of inculcating and creating the next generation of biosummiteers that are going to lead us into, you know, a great community citizen bio revolution and continue that process. The applications are available on biosummit.org/fellowship, I believe, or fellows. And you can still apply. The applications are due on June 21st at midnight, Eastern Standard Time. And finally, I think I had one more thing to say. Oh, we will provide more information on upcoming town halls like this and webinars in our next newsletter. So with that, thank you so much to my panelists. Thank you so much to David and the entire team. And thank you so much to everybody that attended. I hope that you found this to be really useful, because I definitely did.